Hello. Thank you for joining this Vital Sites webinar on OECMs. What are they? What counts? I'm Brent Mitchell. I'm a vice chair, thematic vice chair of WCPA, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. After an introduction by Dr. Madhu Rao, chair of IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas, we will have two presentations, followed by three examples of OECMs from national experts. We will then entertain questions. Please now use the chat function to introduce yourself and give us a sense of why you're interested in this topic. And now we will have the introduction from Madhu.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining this Vital Sites webinar on OECMs. What are they? What counts? I'm Madhu Rao, chair of the IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas. As governments negotiate the new Global Biodiversity Framework, there is strong and growing global support for effectively protecting and conserving at least 30% of the Earth's land, sea, and freshwater ecosystems by 2030 as a key requirement for halting and beginning to reverse biodiversity loss, as well as contributing to addressing the climate crisis. Protecting and conserving at least 30% by 2030 must be addressed in the context of recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and be combined with applying effective sustainability measures across the remaining 70% of the planet. A critical point is that to be successful, protecting and conserving 30% of the planet must focus on effective and equitable protected and conserved areas that are in places important for biodiversity conservation. Under the Convention on Biological Diversity, conserved areas will be implemented as other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs, following the CBD decision and IUCN guidance. This webinar looks at the opportunities and challenges in implementing the OECM's idea and the need to speak a common language in what they mean and how they are implemented. Session 1 will set the stage with essential explanations and clarifications regarding what should count as an OECM under Target 3. This will be followed by regional webinars anticipated every 1.5 to 2 months. Each session is 90 minutes in length, and recordings will be shared widely. As we move into the session, please post questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. We will take up these questions after all the presentations are concluded.
Great. Thank you, Madhu, from the first session today. Now we will hear from Stephen Woodley on the context for OECMs in global conservation targets. Stephen is Vice Chair for Science and Biodiversity with IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas and a member of the OECM Specialist Group. Stephen?
Brent, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today, and my role is to set the context for OECMs inside the larger conservation agenda. I suppose the first thing I'd like to say is that this is an enormous conservation opportunity. The idea in the Global Biodiversity Framework that we were going to protect at least 30% of land, sea, and fresh water is a great opportunity. And that opportunity comes really because of a rather dire set of problems. And I don't think I need to go over them in any detail with this group. We're all aware that biodiversity is in decline globally, whether you look at the IPBES report on biodiversity and ecosystem services, or the documents signed by thousands of scientists as a warning to humanity that biodiversity is declining dramatically on our planet, and we need to act quickly to do something about it. The The need to change what we're doing is shown well in this curve by the late and great Georgina Mace, published in Nature Sustainability. And it shows that we've been declining significantly in whatever biodiversity value you measure from 1970. And we need to bend this curve to be successful. And in order to bend the curve, we have to do many things. And area-based conservation is an essential part of that, but it's not the only thing that needs to be done. We have to keep area-based conservation in context. The world is developing right now a global biodiversity framework. It's in draft. Many of you will be deeply aware of it. And it sets a set of goals and targets based upon changing or bending the curve on biodiversity loss. This diagram, which is a little complex, comes from a brand new publication which looks at the global biodiversity framework and how the targets and the indirect drivers and the direct drivers interact. The one that we're concerned about is right in the middle column on target 3. It's protected areas and OECMs. The point in showing this is that all of these targets are interconnected. And if we're going to be successful in meeting our goals for ecosystems, species, and genes, we need to do all 21 targets. Absolutely, target 3 is fundamental. We can't do it without target 3, but we need to see it in a broader context. So where did this 30% number come from? We'll spend a few minutes on this question. A number of folks from the WCPA did a review of the evidence for area-based conservation measures and looked at what the literature said collectively on how much we needed to conserve nature. We looked at a whole bunch of papers. We looked specifically at 70 studies. There are 3 approaches to setting conservation targets. One is using species area curves. That's what E.O. Wilson used in his Half Earth book. How much area do we need to protect all the species or a high percentage of the species? Another way to do it is to look at minimum sizes of ecosystems to avoid regime shift. And the classic example of this is the Amazon. We know if the Amazon gets deforested at over 20%, it is highly likely it will go to a regime shift where it will shift from being a rainforest to a savanna. There is a recent warning on this last week. And the other is systematic conservation planning. And this is by far the most common way used in the literature to come up with these targets. And I'll show you how that works. If you look at the percentage of an area, whether it's a region or the whole planet on the y-axis and the ecological values stacked on the x-axis, almost all papers say we should worry about protecting endangered species and ecosystems. Almost all talk about geographically restricted species and ecosystems. Almost all talk about really important species aggregations like spawning sites or migratory bird sites. But as you add these things together, there's some overlap between them, but they're additive. So the percentage of the area we need to protect goes up. Adding in other values in conservation planning, such as representation or population viability, areas for ecological connectivity, wilderness areas, and I'll note that wilderness areas is part of Target 1 in the Global Biodiversity Framework. Climate change refugia, where biodiversity will be under a changing climate, and carbon-rich ecosystems. These are the most commonly reported values in the literature. And if you look at what the literature says from a systematic perspective, that we need at least 30%. That is the absolute minimum value set. There's not a single paper in the literature which says we need less than 30%. So that is, it's a science-based value, but it's really a minimum value. If you add in everything that is important to protect, we get to very high numbers of 70%. and the average of those is 50. So the calls for half Earth or nature needs half are not misplaced at all. If you look at the conclusions of this review, the thing to reinforce is that the 30% is a real minimum, that a call for 50% is well supported in the ecological literature. We ran a survey, a global survey of conservation scientists to see what they thought of these numbers. Outstanding support for these really high levels of conservation. And the Zoological Society ran a survey globally of what the public thought. These are people on the street, and they supported these levels, these high levels. They looked at 8 countries in the world. But a key message coming out of this is that it's not really about the percentage area targets. It's about how well they are implemented in terms of quality. They must be effectively managed in the right place to conserve nature. This diagram outlines the fundamentals of IUCN's green list of protected and conserved areas, and I'm using conserved areas and OECMs interchangeably. We know what we're trying to do is halt biodiversity loss. We're not trying to just add up a scorecard of areas protected and conserved. We're trying to halt biodiversity loss. And to do that, to have conservation outcomes, we know we need good governance, we know we need effective management, and we know we need sound design and planning. All of these things are wanting in any system we look at in the world. So the upgrades that are required for quality are fundamental here, and we need to keep this front and center as we implement OECMs. Nothing is more important. So that we are speaking a common language, the World Commission on Protected Areas, in partnership with UNEP, World Conservation Monitoring Center, and partners from National Geographic and BirdLife and Wildlife Conservation Society, recently published this document. It's available in 4 languages, and it says really what should count to this 30 by 30 figure so that we can speak a common language. We need clarity on what counts, and there's a lot of confusion right now, I think, about what counts, and especially around OECMs, and it's why we put out this document. It relies really heavily on the CBD decision and IUCN guidance, but IUCN guidance and the CBD decision are really interlocked. A key point coming out of this is that if we're trying to protect at least 30%, it does not mean that we can forget about the rest. We need to have sustainability measures across the remaining 70% of the planet to be successful. And that's where that earlier diagram on the Global Biodiversity Framework comes into place. We need to implement all 21 targets. So the key messages coming out of what counts for at least 30% is that we're really only talking in this 30% figure, protected areas and OECMs, or protected and conserved areas. That's it. There's no other categories to invent. We need to follow the CBD and IUCN guidance. We really need to support all 4 governance types. These are not just areas managed by government. And there is, as everyone knows, an enormous opportunity to focus on Indigenous protected areas and local community protected areas if we're going to be successful. We have to get the OECM part right, and my colleague Harry Jonas is going to go into the details of that in the next presentation. I think it's probably important to restate that OECMs are not meant to be multiple use production areas. That's in the 70, where we have well-managed production forests and plantations and fisheries areas. But more importantly, it's not just about a percentage figure that's meant to incent conservation action. It's about conserving nature, and that's what we need to focus on and what you'll see in the examples today. Biodiversity on our planet is not distributed everywhere equally. It's rather distributed unequally. So we must put these places where they're going to make the most difference for conservation. This applies to OECMs as well as protected areas. We haven't done this well in the past, and it's really clear that OECMs have to focus on areas that are important for biodiversity. I want to highlight the Key Biodiversity Areas Standard, which was developed by IUCN. There is a world database on key biodiversity areas. You see there's 17,000 sites identified, and many countries are working on their own national programs to identify sites. This is a really important way to understand importance. And there are others as well. In the marine areas, there's EPSAs and important marine mammal areas, etc. And there's one more point this is fundamental to bring, and I know Harry's going to focus on it as well, that we're not going to do this without the leadership, support, and partnership of Indigenous peoples and local communities. We know this. We know conservation works best when it's equitable, based upon free, prior, and informed consent. And this has to be front and center. People are concerned that the 30 by 30 initiative, it will displace people, will be seen as a land grab. I can tell you from an IUCN perspective, that is not how we're envisaging this 30 by 30 solution. It has to be done in full partnership with Indigenous and local communities. And if we don't do that, we won't be successful. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing. I hope that set the context for people, and I will turn it over to my friend and colleague.
We will now have a presentation to help us understand the fundamentals of OECMs. Dr. Kathy McKinnon is the former WCPA chair, and she currently co-chairs the WCPA OECM Specialist Group, together with Harry Jonas, who is Senior Director of Conservation Areas at WWF US. Over to you, Kathy.
Thanks very much, Madhu. I'm presenting this on behalf of myself and Harry Jonas. Together, we lead the OECM Specialist Group for WCPA. And Stephen has given you the context of 30 by 30. We're now going to go into more detail about what are OECMs. First of all, as Stephen said, they represent a significant step forward in the recognition of sites beyond protected areas that deliver the long-term in situ conservation of biodiversity. And this was first recognized back in 2010 when parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity developed the 20 Aichi Targets. Aichi Target 11 specifically references other effective area-based conservation measures, with the recognition, as Stephen said, that there are many areas that are not formal protected areas, but because of their governance and management, they do deliver effective and long-term biodiversity outcomes. And many of those areas may well be managed and governed by Indigenous and local people. However, the parties never made a definition at that time, and they didn't develop criteria for what they meant by OECMs. So at the end of 2015, beginning of 2016, WCPA set up a task force. And we developed draft guidance, both on the definition and on criteria for determining what should be an OECM. That guidance went out for global review, including to CBD parties with the help of the CBD Secretariat. It was presented at many CBD expert workshops and substance. And finally, in 2018 in Egypt at COP14, the CBD came up with a decision, 14/8, that gave both a definition and criteria for identifying OECMs. And our input to that was recognized. And subsequently, we then produced the guidance in a technical report recognizing and reporting other effective area-based conservation measures, and that is accessible on the IUCN website. So what is an OECM? It's a geographically defined area other than a protected area, which is governed and managed in ways that achieve positive and sustained long-term outcomes for the in situ conservation of biodiversity. And it may also have associated ecosystem functions and services and cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, or other locally relevant values. But the important point about it is it's a conservation tool. There's a core difference between protected areas and OECMs. Both are meant to deliver effective biodiversity conservation. But protected areas, as defined by IUCN, must have a primary conservation objective. The defining criteria for an OECM is that it should deliver effective and enduring in situ conservation, regardless of its objectives. Just like protected areas, OECMs can exhibit a range of governance types. They may be government, Indigenous peoples and local communities, privately governed and managed, or a combination of any of these. So OECMs are a real opportunity to recognize diverse forms of governance through rights-based approaches. Now, there's a whole spectrum of OECMs. They're all expected to achieve the in situ conservation of biodiversity. But that is achieved in different ways through different governance and management. Some areas will have less deliberate intention to conserve biodiversity. So you'll have areas where we get what we call ancillary conservation. These may be no disturbance areas. They may be sacred natural sites. We'll see an example of that later. They could even be military training areas, or even in some cases, war graves. Then there are areas where we're getting secondary conservation. These are areas that are protected through very low impact use, or they may be watershed or wetland areas, which are initially protected for their ecosystem services. And some of those might even have a secondary conservation objective. And finally, we have areas where conservation is a primary objective. That might include many Indigenous and community conservation areas or privately governed areas. But even though those areas would meet the IUCN guidance on and definition of a protected area, for some reason, they have not been reported and recorded as protected areas. Either government doesn't want to record them, or the governing bodies would prefer that those areas not be recognized as official protected areas. So the CBD decision 14/8 has an annex, and that gives some guiding principles and common characteristics. The first is that OECM should have significant biodiversity values. What does that mean? Well, these may be key biodiversity areas, as Stephen talked about. It's really important that we try and understand where we have important biodiversity and how best to protect it. They may be areas of threatened ecosystems or aggregations of threatened species. The recognition of those OECMs provides an opportunity to support in situ conservation of biodiversity long-term across all ecosystems, marine, terrestrial, and freshwater, under a range of governance and management regimes. OECMs may also be important for protecting ecosystem functions and services, and they're complementary to protected areas. What we're looking for is effective networks of protected areas and OECMs that together contribute to a coherent and well-connected network So there are various opportunities arising from being able to recognize OECMs. First of all, and perhaps most importantly, is the opportunity to recognize and engage and support a range of rights holders and partners in local to global conservation efforts to secure positive and sustained outcomes for biodiversity. Noting that if those areas are within the territories of Indigenous peoples and local communities, the area should be recognized with free, prior, and informed consent of those communities. As Stephen has noted, designation of OECMs is going to be an important tool in expanding and strengthening conservation networks and connectivity. In fact, if we want to reach the target of 30% by 2030, OECMs are going to be critical to that. Of course, there will be some new protected areas, and we need to make existing protected areas more effective. But OECMs are likely to be very important, especially as we aim for that 30% target. And just like protected areas, OECMs not only can have biodiversity benefits, they can also be natural climate solutions, contributing to carbon storage, mitigation, and building resilience to the impacts of climate change. Once they're recognized, those OECMs should be reported to the World Database of OECMs at UNEP WCMC. As you know, WCMC keeps a record of all the conservation targets. They have the protected area database, and that with the OECM database will decide how successful parties are in reaching the 30% target. So what might constitute an OECM? We gave some examples in our technical guidance. So likely areas are Indigenous and community conserved areas. Some coastal and marine areas protected from interference for reasons other than conservation, i.e. some of those ancillary conservation areas. The major shipwrecks at Scapa Flow in Scotland would count. These are war graves, so they've been left totally protected. And because of that protection, biodiversity has flourished. Then there are some areas in production landscapes that may be managed for conservation rather than exploitation. We're not talking about narrow strips left along riverbanks, but major areas with important biodiversity. We'll give an example of that from the Harapan rainforest in Indonesia. There'll be some major watershed protection areas and some community pastures with native grasslands, and some sections, as I said, of military reserves where restrictions exist to reduce access, and there may even be some subsidiary management for conservation. Areas that are less likely or even unlikely are urban parks and other formal gardens where there's little native biodiversity, temporary fishing closures in places until an overfished area recovers, heavily grazed grasslands or grasslands replanted with monocultures of non-native species for livestock. Large landscape or seascape scale management policies targeting a limited number of species are unlikely to be OECMs. We're talking about fishing or hunting restrictions on individual species. And it's also unlikely that many ocean areas or forest areas managed for large scale extraction will be classified as OECMs. Those areas, if they're sustainably managed, may be more appropriately mapped to other targets. But we have to remember that OECMs are a conservation target and are mapped to the new target 3. Now, it's hard to say that all areas that are watersheds will be OECMs. That's not the case. Other criteria come into play. So all potential OECMs should be screened very carefully on a case-by-case basis. For marine areas, for marine OECMs, it's important that they're protecting and conserving ecosystems and habitats, and allowing the maintenance and recovery of viable populations of species in their natural surroundings, not just a sustainable population of one or a few commercially important species. IUCN recommends that there should be no vertical zoning for OECMs, just as we do for protected areas. So OECMs in the marine context could include locally managed marine areas that result in long-term conservation of biodiversity, permanent or long-term fisheries closures designed to protect complete habitats and stop recruitment, areas that are designed to protect specialized ecosystems and are effective against fishery and non-fishery threats. And again, we've cited the Wargraves example. Marine OECMs will not be areas that are only temporarily closed to the fishing of specific depleted commercial fish species. They shouldn't be areas where fisheries or other activities are habitat damaging. And they shouldn't be areas closed only when a vulnerable species are present at a vulnerable life stage, e.g. spawning aggregations. Now, these are general principles. As I said, we need to look at sites on a case-by-case basis. There will be some exceptions, I'm sure, to many of these rules. But the important thing is that we're getting effective long-term biodiversity outcomes. So OECMs are important because they help to conserve important ecosystems, habitats, and wildlife corridors, support the recovery of threatened species, maintain ecosystem functions, and secure ecosystem services, and of course, particularly relevant to carbon storage and water quality and quantity. They can help to enhance resilience against harmful threats, including climate change, as nature-based solutions. They will help to maintain and connect remnants of fragmented ecosystems to help build mosaics of land and water use that together lead to an effective conservation network. And they can contribute to ecologically representative and well-connected conservation networks integrated within wider landscapes and seascapes, including key biodiversity areas and transboundary areas. Now, there's some key questions if you're embarking on recognizing OECMs. The first is really, is there important biodiversity in the area? If the answer is yes, is the area already a protected area? If it's already a protected area, you need go no further. You cannot have an area that is both a protected area and an OECM. If it has important biodiversity and it's not already a protected area, then it's important to know whether those responsible for governance and management of the area agree to it being assessed as an OECM. This especially is relevant to territories of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And it's also worth considering whether the area might be better considered as a sustainable use area under targets 5 or 10, if the primary intent is more sustainable management in a production landscape. And while the assessment is going on, it's important to try and understand why is the area delivering effective long-term conservation, and what kinds of support are needed to help maintain or increase the effective conservation of those important biodiversity values. Is it legislation, other regulatory mechanisms, incentives such as payments for ecosystem services to the stewards of the land? Is it better recognition of land and use rights? Is it funding? And these are questions that should come up during the assessment. Finally, the specialist group has pulled together a series of resources, all available on the IUCN WCPA website. The technical report and guidance I've already referred to. It's available through the IUCN portals. The CBD has also asked IUCN WCPA to provide further guidance. There's a WCPA technical note, number 6, that gives you a quick overview of OECMs. This is only 4 pages, so worth taking a quick read. There are training materials to provide an introduction to OECMs, also available on the website. We brought out a special issue of the WCPA journal, Parks, giving some examples of potential cases of OECMs. That also is freely available on the Parks website. Currently, we're preparing a simple, user-friendly assessment tool to be used at the site level to go into more detail and help define whether an area should be regarded and reported as an OECM. And we're also pulling together a series of frequently asked questions, and we hope that some of your questions today will contribute to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathy. We want to move into the next section of this webinar, in which we want to give you some real world examples. And we'll now hear from expert panelists on an OECM site. Each panelist will have up to 5 minutes to share the main points of their example. These will be followed by a panel discussion, including all our 4 panelists and responses to your questions. In addition to Kathy, we have 3 expert panelists today. Florence Paya is an ecologist and conservationist with the Observatory for Central African Forests, or COMIFAC, working on forest biodiversity and carbon issues. She is WCPA Regional Vice Chair for Central and West Africa. We have Dr. Vinod Mathur, who's former director of the Wildlife Institute of India and now serves as the chairperson of the National Biodiversity Authority, working on protected areas and OECMs. We finally have Imen Miliani. She is a marine specialist, vice president of IUCN, and works on marine protected areas and OECMs. We will start with Kathy presenting an example from Indonesia. Over to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Madhu. Ruchia, can we have it up on the screen? Thanks. This is a potential OECM from Indonesia. It's the Harapan Forest Ecosystem Restoration Concession. Harapan means hope. This is promoted as a forest of hope in Indonesia. And it's an exciting innovation in conservation tools available in that country. The area was a logging concession, and it's still recognized as production forest. It has important biodiversity values. It's a key biodiversity area. It's 99,000 hectares of tropical lowland rainforest, which is now getting rarer and rarer in Sumatra and is underrepresented in the protected area network. As I said, the area was previously a logging concession, and it's still regarded as a concession, but it is now leased to a consortium of NGOs that includes BirdLife International, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and others, including a local partner, Burung Indonesia. So the governance is private. The management objective is conservation. Although parts of this area have been logged previously, there are still very good stands of remaining rainforest, and the area is being managed still under the banner of production forest, but with a conservation objective. This is an area that not only protects important areas of tropical lowland rainforest, but also a whole suite of charismatic species that you'd expect associated with that. So tigers, sun bears, gibbons, a really interesting bird fauna. So it's a very exciting and new way of looking at conservation. The area, therefore, is not a protected area, even though it could have qualified as one according to the IUCN criteria. The government didn't want to recognize it as a protected area. They prefer to keep it as an area that they can lease under the production forest banner. The lease is long-term. It's for 99 years. And what's particularly exciting about this initiative is that the partners were able to work with the government of Indonesia to develop and approve new legislation for ecosystem restoration concessions. So not only is this an exciting example of a new way of doing conservation in Indonesia, it's now being replicated in other places and on other islands. As far as monitoring goes, there's regular research and monitoring going on of key species, and including collecting a lot of data through camera traps. I think this is a very exciting initiative. As yet, it hasn't been reported as an OECM, but I think it's a good example of what could be done, particularly in areas of habitats that are underrepresented in current protected area networks, and yet are really important areas for biodiversity. Anybody who would like to see more information on this example, there is a paper about it in Park's special issue that I referred to earlier, which is available at the Parks Journal website. I'm going to stop there, Madhu, but I'm happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you, Kathy. Next, we have Florence, who will be presenting an example from Cameroon. Over to you, Florence.
Thank you, Madhu. Yeah, I have to present an example of a potential OECM in Cameroon called Sacred Forest. In Cameroon, the site of Sacred Forest is not just an island of forest for spiritual value, but also for biodiversity importance, specifically forestic biodiversity. And as you see, there are some biodiversity monitoring was done, and we see that there are 6 species in vulnerable situation. And also, as you see in the map, there's also some identification of the sacred forest. The reason why I don't want to talk just about one example, because there's some network in the north of the country and the west of the country. Sacred forest is natural and cultural importance because around this island forest, there's community with traditional rules and some restriction. And in the legislation, sacred forest is not a protected area, but protected space is different. And because we are talking about potential OECM, yeah, sacred forest could be a potential OECM. Understanding in the introduction the different criteria, and sacred forest has some criteria that could be interesting for at the national level. The management is a traditional one. That means there's leader, traditional leader with prohibition. The access is regulated because the use of natural resource is not for all people. The natural resource is used for health, is used for well-being, is used for some specific habits regarding a spiritual act or something regarding traditional, focus on traditional is not something like indigenous people, is value and is specific. In national level, there are some convention and political based legislation, but Forest Act is not directly considered as protected area for conservation. And after some study in 2010, they identified a number of sacred forests, and there is a gap because we can say now if this space are for conservation because there are some traits like logging or degradation of forests. But we think that sacred forests in Cameroon could be considered like an OECM. There is a program with the Rainforest Alliance start last year, and they want to help traditional leaders to have delimitation around this space to improve cultural or traditional tourism and to awareness the community around this space to have an access directly or to contribute to degradation this island forest, and if there's no protection through legislation, we can lose most of this space. Thank you, Madhu.
Thank you very much, Florence. We'll move very quickly next to Dr. Vinod Mathur, who will present an example from India. Over to you, Vinod.
Thank you, Madhu, for providing this opportunity. I must share with our group that India's foray into OECM is of recent origin. We started in early 2019, and in 2 years' time, we have been able to put up a structure. The first task was to come up with a classification of what categories could be included under OECM. And we heard Kathy saying about different options that we have. We looked at very carefully, and the guiding point being that if an area is already covered under a protected area, it can't be an OECM. So right now we stand at a situation where 22% of India's geographic area is already under protected area network in forms of national parks, sanctuaries, and reserve forests. And India has recently joined the 30 by 30 High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. So the big challenge before us is that how do we move from our existing 22% to 30%? And that is where we feel that looking at options that we could have under OECM, that would be a strategy that India is adopting. And here we have developed, and we would be very willing to share with others, 15 category classification for OECMs in India. And these constitute or comprise of a large number of entities, which, as I said, are not under protected areas. But on one side, we have the engagement of the communities, and we have gone the other side to shake hands with the corporates. I do get a feeling that many times our practitioners are not very willing to talk to the corporates, but that is not the approach that we are now following under OECM. So on one side, we want to engage the communities with all the kind of prior informed consent and their understanding, but we also want to unlock the resources which the corporates have. So communities on one side, corporate on the other, and our tool being that of convergence. So under this context, we have been able to identify, as you see in front of your eyes, the Aravali Biodiversity Park just outside Delhi and Haryana on the border, an area of 392 acres. Interestingly, it was an old abandoned mining site, which has now been transformed into a green forest. This is owned by the local municipality, of Gurugram, or Gurgaon as we call it. An NGO, interestingly named as I Am Gurgaon, came and worked till 2020. And then the municipality then decided that we could engage a corporate, and the Hero Moto Group, those who know about the motorcycles, the Hero Honda motorcycles, the famous with the Japanese collaboration, that group came forward, and it is now working in seeing to it that we give the Aravali Biodiversity Park a good name under an OECM. There are about 400 plus native plant species. The best part of OECM, and that I want to share with everyone else, is what kind of benefits it can bring. So Kathy has already talked about several benefits, and I would like to add here that this area, in a dry arid area in India, is serving to recharge over 320 million liters of water in a water scarce region. So we need to look at the biodiversity and define biodiversity in a slightly all-encompassing way. And the best part was that last month, when the Honorable Prime Minister of India was inaugurating the World Sustainable Development Summit, he made a special mention about the OECM, the first OECM in India. And if we can hear from the Honorable Prime Minister, it is not very often that we get to hear the Prime Minister talking of conservation or biodiversity conservation or protected area or OECM. Here is what, if I can request, if you can just touch on this picture, it will come up and hear from him that what the Prime Minister of India has to say. Thank you very much for providing this opportunity, but let's hear the Prime Minister.
India is a mega diverse country. With 2.4% of the world's land area, India accounts for nearly 8% of the world's species. It is our duty to protect this ecology. We are strengthening our protected area network. The IUCN has recognized our efforts. The Aravali Biodiversity Park in Haryana has been declared as an OECM site for its effective conservation of biodiversity.
Thank you very much for that opportunity. As I said, we are very much delighted to get the attention of the Prime Minister. And we have, at this point of time, identified about 100 OECM. And we hope that by the end of this year, that is 2022, in December, we should be able to identify about 500 OECMs to begin with. So definitely we need to look at the 30% target, but we are sure that with the kind of an effort and the encouragement that we are getting, and this collaboration and this convergence that I have talked about, we should be able to meet that target. Thank you very much for providing this opportunity. Back to you, Madhu.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Vinod, for that excellent presentation. We move to the final example. Iman Melian will present an example from Canada for us. Over to you, Iman.
Thanks, Madhu, and hi, everyone. It was actually quite difficult to choose a marine example to present because of the variety that we have. And just to answer, start answering some of the questions, currently there are 192 marine OECMs that have been recognized and reported to the World Database on OECMs. Most of these are from Canada and the Philippines. A few are from the UK and South Africa. I think this example is a recognized OECM that has been reported to the World Database on OECMs. It's in a deep sea coral ecosystem. It's the Lophelia Coral Conservation Area, which is the only known Lophelia pertusa coral reef, deep sea coral reef in Canadian waters. So the important biodiversity values of the site is the only living Glophilia pertusa reef complex, and these deep sea corals are also known as hotspots for biodiversity, as they host a variety of other species. Most of them are rare and endangered, and I think the marine community has heard a lot about these deep sea vulnerable marine ecosystem, which has been in the spotlight. So this is a site that's governed by the government of Canada, and most precisely by the Fisheries and Ocean Canada. So it's a state-managed site. It is not a protected area. It's been established since 2004, and it has a permanent nature. And one of the things that's important or interesting in this site is also the monitoring. Given that this is a deep sea ecosystem, it's quite challenging to monitor that. So a lot of the monitoring is of the enforcement of the measure, which is a ban on bottom trawling, and that is good because we could see how through a vessel monitoring system that the site is not being fished, and there is no fishing in the coral conservation areas. And some in situ optical surveys have been done to actually document that the density and abundance of the species has increased within the coral conservation areas. And it is important because I think some of these deep sea habitat, more of offshore habitat, have been lacking, or this is one area where there is complementarity, as Kathy said, between OECMs and protected areas when we look at the overall network. And you can hear or learn more about this site in these two links provided. There was an in-depth assessment going through each of the CBD criteria done through an ICES workshop, and you have the report there. I don't want to be long because I see a lot of questions, and we want to enable some time for discussion. So I'll stop here.
Thanks very much, Iman. That was really fantastic. We're doing well on time, and I think we can jump into the Q&A session right now with all our panelists. I would like to call on Kathy perhaps to get us started on the first three questions in the Q&A box, Kathy. The first is whether recognizing OECMs and privately protected areas, are we not talking about de facto protected areas that are effective on the ground versus state-run paper parks backed by legislation, but that is not often enforced? Over to you, Kathy.
So thanks very much for the question. In fact, we are talking about de facto protected areas. And that was the recognition that these are areas that, for whatever reason, because of their governance and management, they are protecting biodiversity. But in many cases, they weren't being acknowledged as protected areas or reported. And this is the challenge for us, is it's not so much, as Stephen said, about reaching a percentage target. Making sure that the areas that we have, where we have important biodiversity, that they are protected. So many OECMs could indeed qualify according to the IUCN definition as a protected area. For various reasons, they aren't being reported and recorded as such. And this is a way of really finding out where those areas are. Many of the areas that have been reported so far as OECMs have been reported by government. The example that Iman has just given is a good example of that. But you know what we're doing is we're talking about a continuum for biodiversity conservation, all the way from protected areas and OECMs at one end, along through sustainable use to mainstreaming at the other. All of these things are good. It's just that as we aim for these targets, which are useful, we need to be clear about what's a conservation target and what's sustainable use. So I think, as Stephen said, OECMs give us this great opportunity to recognize where we do have effective biodiversity conservation and to recognize those areas, whether they're private, Indigenous people or local communities managing them, or governments managing them, to make sure that together with protected areas, they provide an effective conservation network. An area could easily move from being an OECM to be formally recognized as a protected area. Some governments do, in fact, report community conserved areas as part of their protected area data. The Scarpa Flow example I gave, I believe the Scottish Government is now even talking about it as a marine protected area. So this is not a hard and rigid line. But the important thing is to recognize areas where we get biodiversity outcomes. I hope that answers the query.
Thanks, Kathy. It does, and it answers a few other queries in the list, so thank you for that. I think the second question was related to the mechanism of marine conservation agreements, and I wonder if you can speak to that. As to the question being, for marine OECMs and privately protected areas, I wonder why we do not hear more about marine conservation agreements.
I can take that, Madhu,
Okay,
if you want,
okay.
because I'm very familiar with the concept of marine conservation agreement, and I believe the Nature Conservancy has worked quite a lot of that. Just as for those who are not aware of the concept, marine conservation agreement is an agreement generally with private sector, but doesn't have to be, that has a conservation objective, and that's kind of more of the equivalent of private protected areas in the marine environment. They could be an OECM, and I think part of the reason why we're not hearing more about them is people are just starting to explore and assess the OECMs. There are a couple in most of these marine conservation agreements generally have a coastal component. I think that there are many opportunities. There are a few that are starting to be assessed within the Mediterranean, and in France in particular, with the Conservatoire du Littoral, who has some areas like Tour du Valat has an area that could be marine conservation agreement. So I think they could be an example. Again, as Kathy said, an assessment of an OECM, it is important that it is done on a case-by-case basis to try to recognize what the biodiversity values of the sites are, what are the biodiversity outcomes, and are the measures within the site effective to maintain these biodiversity outcomes in the long term. So I think the example that's provided, it's worth assessing, and I would encourage Sibylle to do so. Thanks.
Thank you, Iman. While I have you there, could you please explain what is vertical zoning?
Sure. So vertical zoning, I mean, people are used, and everyone, terrestrial and marine experts are used to the zoning within protected areas where you could have a core protected area, a buffer zone, and so forth. The vertical zoning is when we have different measures within the water column. And so in some cases, we have restrictions more towards the bottom trawling. And actually the Canadian OECM is one that prohibits bottom fishing because in these deep sea ecosystem. And that it might allow pelagic fisheries to happen within high levels of the water column. And so that is what vertical zoning is.
Thank you very much, Iman. And Vinod, if I can call on you to answer this question about OECMs in a highly urbanized city-state like Singapore. The question being, we wonder whether our buffer parks, nature parks or nature ways, which are roadside planting, planted specifically to attract biodiversity and to connect with our protected areas, would be considered OECMs, and to what extent can we apply the OECMs in the context of Singapore's national context and circumstance. Vinod, I'd be grateful if you gave that a shot. Thank you.
So thank you, Madhu, for raising a very interesting observation. And I think it is very relevant for all countries which are looking at these OECMs in an urban setting. And I would say that we need to also have a little out of the box thinking. And I would say that and Singapore is a perfect example that in a small urban area, you have set up these parks. And when I visited, and I'm sure you were there with me, we were very impressed to see that the concept of connectivity and corridors was being extended to butterflies. So see, we are right now having difficulty in explaining to people why connectivity conservation is important for tigers, elephants, and other large herbivores. But the whole idea is that, and we need to add on to this discussion, that we can think of an OECM cluster. See, because in case of Singapore, these bodies are very, very small. These parks are very, very small. So instead of individually giving them a status of an OECM, why can't we think of an OECM cluster? We give it any name, but we use a cluster approach, which is very similar to those of you who know about the Natural World Heritage Conservation, where we started with single sites, and now we talk of the serial sites nomination. And I would give an example that the Western Ghats in India is not just one site. These are 39 sites spread across 4 states of India. So similarly, we can think of, and I'm prepared to open up a debate. I can see Kathy responding to it, but think in terms of a cluster. But yes, certainly they would qualify over there. And already on the lines of what I'm saying, in Delhi, the municipality has set up 8 different urban parks. So instead of dealing them with 8 parks, we can think of putting them as a cluster, and also think of how the concept of corridor and connectivity will pan out for bees and butterflies. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinod. Iman, did you want to add to that? You have your hand up.
Yes, I do, because I think this is an interesting concept. Vinod, this was discussed in the Baltic Sea region as they considered marine OECMs. The cluster of very small sites that individually may not give enough protection, but very close by cluster of OECM, that recognition may be useful, particularly if there are additional measures to be applied to the cluster. This was the case in the marine environment. This was the case of sunken ship. So these are archaeological sites where you have a very strong protection, but for a very tiny area. But there are many of them next to each other, and then recognizing the cluster might provide higher conservation. So this concept is also being talked about in the marine. Just wanted to add to that. Thanks.
Thanks, Iman. We'll take one question on regarding production areas. The question being, why production areas with stable and long-term biodiversity conservation management are not likely recognized as OECMs? If a certain area managed only for biodiversity, then it's just another type of non-governmental ownership PA. Should we take measures as the core in OECM? I wonder, Kathy, if you can respond to that, or Iman.
I'm happy to respond to this. I think, again, you've got to look at this on a case-by-case basis. So I do know of areas proposed as OECMs in South Africa, where there's an important wetland within a forestry concession. Logging is going on in the forest. The wetland is protected, but they're all within one area. The wetland part would qualify as an OECM. The production part would not. And I think this is where you've got to be careful. Like I said, the CBD recognizes both conservation and sustainable use. And there are targets proposed accordingly to deal with with both of those components. Target 3, which is specifically and mentions OECMs, it's specifically protected areas and OECMs. It's just target 3. There are other sustainable management targets. 5 and 10 come to mind. If an area is being sustainably managed for production, then perhaps it should be mapped to one of those other targets. If there are substantial areas set aside within a production landscape where it's obvious that you're getting effective long-term conservation, not an area that's just left for 20 years and then is clear felled, then perhaps it should be considered for an OECM, depending on what its biodiversity values are and whether they're likely to be sustained. So again, I think you really need to look at this on a case-by-case basis. But it's very hard and very interesting also with OECMs. You can't just say these category of areas qualify as OECMs. The exercise that's happened in India is really interesting because Vinod and partners have come up with these different categories. But within those categories, some areas would qualify as OECMs and others may not. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Kathy. And I think it's related to another question, which is about high HCV areas in production landscapes. I think that would, can high conservation value areas in the production landscapes that have active management for biodiversity be considered OECMs?
Again, possibly, yes, depending on the extent of those areas and whether they're going to be sustained, whether they're going to be viable long term. But again, you need to look at it on a case-by-case basis.
We have, thank you, Kathy. We have one interesting question about KBAs. So KBAs, IPAs, IBAs, which can qualify for OECMs, are international zoning initiatives, but are not formally recognized nationally. Can we consider nationally recognized areas important for biodiversity in NBSAPs as potential OECMs?
Are you referring that to me, or I see?
Or anybody, it's open to anyone who wants to take it. Iman?
This has been common in so many times. I think these areas, if and in many cases they are nationally or regionally recognized, but I think it is important whether this area has management measures that enable the effective conservation of these biodiversity value and sustaining these biodiversity value in the long term. So when you have an overlap of the IBA, KBA, whatever EB says in the marine environment, with a management measure or specially applied management measures that enable these biodiversity, then yes. But just the recognition that the site is an important biodiversity area without any management measures applicable within the site, then it's simply not an OECM. And that confusion comes often, so it's helpful to recognize that.
Thanks, Iman. And I think there are a few questions related to the broader 30 by 30 target, and I'm referring to Sue Wells's question about if countries have identified sites that might contribute to the target, should there be guidance that they should first consider whether the site should be made a PA first rather than an OECM? And I suppose she also wanted to understand why the example you presented was not considered a PA. Thanks.
So I'll take this one. I think there's a good reason why governments often don't recognize protected areas, or other partners don't push for those areas to be recognized as protected areas. And one of the commentators has written that in the Q&A and chat, that it often takes a long time to gazette an area as a protected area. If it's a government managed protected area, resources have to be allocated. I know that was the reason why Harapan was kept as a production forest rather than a protected area, because then the financial responsibilities actually go to somebody else rather than the government, or it was one reason for doing that. And revenues also go to the local government. So that can be a reason why an area is not a protected area. Look, I think we need to recognize, that OECMs are not some inferior designation. They should be equivalent to an effective protected area in delivering biodiversity outcomes, and they should be recognized as such. And that's why it's important that we do support them. So they're equivalent, they're comparable, and they supplement protected areas. In the particular case of Scapa Flow, like I said, areas can move across to protected areas if a government decides to recognize them and report them to the World Database on Protected Areas. And in the case of Scapa Flow, I believe the Scottish government is now intending to do that. Thanks. I see Imen has her hand up as well.
Just to complement, because there was a similar question on the Canadian example and also a last question on category 5 OECM. So for the Canadian example, it's exactly that. As Kathy said, it was more cumbersome, lengthier procedure, more complex procedure to go via the MPA route, and they could have done that. They found it much easier to declare this as a coral conservation area under the Fisheries Act, and it gave more quickly the needed protection measure for these deep sea habitat, because deep sea fishing and deep sea bottom trawling in particular was the only threat at the time. Now that there are potentially other threats like oil and gas exploration, then they're considering collaboration with other sectors, and they might be moving beyond just the fisheries. So it's important to note these evolutions. The last question on category 5, I want to highlight a terrestrial example of the Algerian OECMs, which are cultural sites that actually meet the definition of a category 5 protected area. But within Algeria, there is a law that separates the natural protected areas from the cultural protected areas. And so the cultural protected areas are managed by the Ministry of Culture, and the others are managed by the Forestry Department, and they cannot overlap. There is a very specific law. So there could never be considered, and for years, Algeria wanted to recognize these and report these, but could never be considered. And the moment OECM's definition was up, they recognized these cultural site as OECM. So sometimes it really depends also on the national legislation.
Imen, that's useful that you ended with the national legislation. I think we have a question here on I want to know if some countries have in their general legislation the concept of OECMs, not guidelines. And I'd also like to invite Vinod to make a comment on this from India. Vinod, are you available?
Yeah. Thank you, Madhu. Yes, that is a very important area of concern for everyone about the kind of legal instruments that need to be invoked for designating OECM. And I would definitely say that we have a thinking at this point when we are looking at being inclusive, when we are looking at communities, we are looking at corporates, we should not be bound too much by a legal instrument. And that is where we want to remain a little more open and say that we already have 4 different kinds of governance which the system allows. It could be government, it could be private, it could be corporate, and so on and so forth. But we will not like to tag the OECMs in India, at least, right at the beginning with enacting a law to do that. Already we have seen the kind of a backlash with putting it up on a legal frame, which is there. But we don't rule it out. Let's do it. Let's start expanding the estate. And as we gather some more experience, then we look into that. And right now what we are doing, we are trying to notify all our OECMs on the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change and the NBA website. So there is a legitimacy there that this effort and initiative is backed by the government, and the government wants. India is already, as I said, a partner of the 30 by 30 coalition. That's very well known. And both the Ministry of External Affairs and the Ministry of Environment are working together. So at this point of time, from our perspective, no need to push hard on the legal framework, but as we develop more experience, as we get more understanding, we will look into that issue at a subsequent point. I hope I've answered, but if there are any subsequent questions, I can take it as well.
Thank you, Vinod. There is one question about who gets to report an OECM, especially if it's an area, if it's a contested area. Kathy, I wonder if you can take that.
Well, the whole concept of OECMs is a government concept. It's a concept that comes out of the CBD. So it's expected that a lot of those reports to the World Database on OECM will either be through governments, through their national reporting, or else endorsed by governments. However, according to WCMC, they will take information directly from other proponents. Now, how that will be resolved, we don't know at the moment, particularly if it's contested. But do be aware that UNEP WCMC holds several databases. They hold the World Database on Protected Areas, which is the official protected area database. They now have this new database on OECMs. They also hold an ICCA registry database where Indigenous communities in peoples and local communities can submit data. And they hold a database on privately protected areas. So it is possible to report things to WCMC where those areas are contested or where they're submitted by other partners. I imagine they would go back to the government focal point and say, do you endorse this? But the process is still being worked out.
Thanks, Kathy. Yes, Imen.
Just to complement on the marine side, which is a question in areas beyond national jurisdiction. As you know, the question of protection beyond areas of national jurisdiction is a live question, particularly this week at the UNGA and the discussion of the High Seas Conservation Agreement. There is a lot of interest by regional fisheries management organizations that have potential OECMs or fisheries measures that could be potential OECMs. And as many of them are going through an exercise of assessing these, that there could be a process for recognizing that, knowing that they would be the governance authority, and that normally decisions in such organizations are by consensus by government. And what is also important is that in these areas beyond national jurisdiction, if there is a measure under an RFMO, then normally it is also respected even by countries that are not party to that RFMO. So there is that potential there for areas beyond national jurisdiction. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we have just 2 minutes left, and I suppose we'll just take one question, which is related to a multi-use estuary. So the question is, you mentioned that multi-use areas should not be considered OECM, but what happens if there is an important nursery area, but which also has multiple use, such as selective fishing, recreational use, which is well managed? Would this not qualify as an OECM? Amen.
Sure. It will depend on the measure and on the area. Again, I think various people are looking at examples for this. And again, you know, as we go through the side-by-side assessment, there are various questions that are important. And normally, it is, what is that biodiversity? Are the measures within the area effective in conserving biodiversity within the long term? And so having the clarity on biodiversity outcome is going to be really important to have that at the forefront, and then to look at the rest of criteria through that lens. So it's possible, and again, it will depend on the case by case.
Now we want to give you some real world examples. And so we'll hear from experts, panelists on OECM sites. Each has up to 5 minutes to share the main points of their examples. These will be followed by our panel discussion, including all 5 panelists and responses to your questions. I will introduce all 3 panelists together. Then Stephen will click through their slides. Juliana Echeverria is Biodiversity Advisor at GIZ Colombia, is part of the Local Protected Areas Regional Project implemented in Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, and is a member of the OECM Task Force. Olaf Jensen is the Director of the Protected Areas Program with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and has worked on protected area management and establishment for over 25 years. Andrew Rhodes Espinoza is Vice Chair of the IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas, Coordinator for Oceans, attached to the Undersecretary for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico, and Sue Sherpa for Mexico before the High-Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy. So, Juliana, if you would please start us off.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for being here with us. I will be presenting some of the results achieved through the project that apply OECM criteria to the Colombian context, and a specific case, Andaki Municipal Natural Park. This project was implemented by an interinstitutional working group that includes Resnatur, Humboldt Institute, Fundación Natura, and the Local Protected Areas Regional Project implemented by GIZ, ICLE, and IUCN. And this project was supported by the Colombian GEF Small Grants Program from 2019 until the end of last year, 2021. Next slide, please. Well, we have been applying the OECM criteria to 29 OECM potential areas. We adapted a methodology like guided from the guide I just Harry just mentioned, and applied with different right holders and stakeholders related to these 29 areas. You can see with all 4 types of governance. Next slide, please. And I will share the criteria of Andaki, the area. Next slide, please. In Colombia, local governments are not able to declare protected areas. However, they carry many conservation measures. This is the case of the Andaki Municipal Natural Park. Is the municipality of Belén de los Andaquíes, located in the Colombian Amazon region, and it covers an area of 26.7 square kilometers. Regarding criteria A, the area is not currently recognized as a protected area, and it does not overlap with a protected area. We checked this data with the National Database of Colombian Protected Areas. For criterion B, next slide, please. The Andaki Park is geographically defined. It has a governance type B. The creation of this area, this municipal park, has been an initiative of social society led by the Tierra Viva Foundation and supported by the municipal government of Belén de los Andaquíes. The administration of the conservation area has been developed through public and private agreements they have. And the land, the natural park, belongs to the municipality of Belén de los Andaquíes, and its legitimate administration correspond to the municipal mayor's office, and it has an agreement like the declaratory recognition from 2009, having a long-term in time conservation measures. Next slide, please. Criteria C achieves sustained and effective contribution to in situ conservation biodiversity. The Andaki Park protects genetic resources, watersheds, in situ biodiversity, and the structure of the landscape. It helps preventing the expansion of livestock systems and other drivers of change. It contributes to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. And it constitutes an important space with land use planning, and together with other national parks and regional protected areas, they improve connectivity. Regarding the criteria D, we can move to the next slide, please. Associated ecosystem functions and services and cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, and other locally relevant values. It conserves different ecosystem services, conservation of the archaeological remains of the Andaki route, a path of historic relevance they have in the territory. They need to update the management plan. They already have it, but they need to update it. And next slide, please. Well, the Andaki Municipal Natural Park was evaluated through the National Route for Reporting OECM that we already have in Colombia, and it was reported to WCMC in November last year, 2021. And also we applied the SAGE methodology to this area, and we consider that it could be a supporting tool to assess OECM governance and equity. I know some of you have that question about the governance, and we have here the link we published an article. And well, thank you for your attention. For more information, you can visit resnatur.org.co and the parks article and some videos we have on YouTube. I will share the links on the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliana. And again, to everybody, we'll be following up with all of these links and resources. So if you somehow miss them during the webinar, we'll make sure to get them to you. Olaf, would you continue, please?
Yeah, thanks very much. And thank you for the opportunity to present to everyone today. If you don't mind going to the next slide, that'd be great. Just a brief overview of where Canada is at currently. So at the end of 2020, Canada recognized, sorry, there's a mistake on this slide, 13.5% of its terrestrial area and 13.9% of its marine territory. The important note on this slide is actually in the chart on the bottom, which indicates how much of Canada's current terrestrial and marine estate is comprised of other effective conservation measures. So you see that Canada makes great use of the OECM tool in the marine environment. 36% of marine and coastal areas are recognized as OECM. And in the terrestrial and freshwater environment, about 6% of our protected areas estate is comprised of OECMs. Next slide, please. In terms of jurisdiction in Canada, just a little bit of context here. Canada has 3 broad regions, if we may frame it that way. In the south, this is largely our settled landscape, agricultural lands, and private lands. And one of the OECM examples I'll present today is in that southern landscape. It's the yellow star in the middle, the bottom center of the screen. The middle boreal portion of Canada is largely our boreal forest, where there's a fair bit of resource extraction, both within the managed forest landscape and extraction for mines and minerals. And the northern portion of Canada in the purple here is largely intact wilderness areas, generally under the jurisdiction of provinces and territories. And there's a significant amount of Indigenous owned land in this region. Canada has a fairly advanced comprehensive land claim process underway, and in Northern Canada in particular, as a result of comprehensive land claim agreements, a significant amount of land is owned and managed by Indigenous peoples, which I think the two examples I'll present here today are probably a good example of the diversity of rights holders that Harry had indicated earlier in the presentation. Next slide, please. So our first example from Southern Canada and largely in the private landscape is actually a military training area in the prairie provinces of South and Central Canada. Canadian Forces Base Shiloh is a military training area managed by the Department of National Defense. About 80 to 85% of the larger training base is recognized as an OECM. It's comprised primarily of natural habitats that are relatively undisturbed. It covers about 231 square kilometers, located in the sensitive mixed grass prairie environment in central Canada. There is an abundant diverse wildlife populations as well as 17 species at risk. This is a good example, I think, of what Harry had pointed out as ancillary conservation. So clearly the primary purpose of this area is training troops for combat readiness, preparing, and largely infantry troops. The kind of activities that take place in this landscape as a result of military training are actually complementary to historical ecological processes and create micro and macro habitats that are important for a range of species in the prairie environment. And this is a really great example of an OECM, we think, in that OECMs are meant to be a recognition of things that already exist. So in this particular landscape, there is an effective means to control a variety of activities. The area is achieving the conservation of biodiversity. And there's a really interesting network or layers of protection through policy, regulation, and legislation that ensure that these effective means will persist over the long term. Next slide, please. And now for something completely different. In Northern Canada, we have a really good example of, I think what Harry had as well pointed out as a primary OECM. So this example I'll describe here in a minute is really something that could be considered as a protected area, but for a number of reasons I'll describe in a minute, it is included in our domestic protected areas database as an OECM. It's also reported to the WDPA as an OECM as well. So within this portion of the Northwest Territories of Canada, within the traditional territory of the Sahtu peoples, and as a result of a constitutionally protected land claim agreement, there are a number of land use zones within this region that are conservation zones. They're meant to emphasize conservation that is defined by community experience, traditional knowledge, and scientific information. The conservation zones within this land use planning area comprise over 3 million hectares. It's a very significant area. The prohibitions through the land use plan, which again have protections constitutionally, legislatively, and through regulation, include prohibition on oil and gas and mineral development, on cutting trees through commercial forestry, and a whole range of other activities. The area, of course, provides multiple benefits to the Sahtu people, and they're used by Indigenous people in ways that are aligned with their traditional practices and worldview. It's a really good example of an area where conservation efforts are Indigenous-led, where the Indigenous government itself is responsible for the management of these lands. In the context of free, prior, and informed consent, it's also interesting in that, given that these areas are Indigenous-led and Indigenous-managed, the concept of free, prior, and informed consent is almost flipped around on its head, where these lands were submitted to the domestic and international protected areas database with the free, prior, and informed consent of governments. So again, they're really strongly Indigenous-led and very important for the Sahtu people. Yeah, and again, they're interested in that. I think by definition, they could be considered as protected areas, but for all the reasons that Harry had pointed out, they are counted as OECMs. Next slide, please. So in terms of the Canadian view on the benefits of OECMs, well, I think the most important point for us is the second point here is we see this as a real opportunity to broaden the inclusion and participation in conservation. We recognize there's a broad range of actors that are undertaking activities that are achieving the effective conservation of biodiversity, and recognizing those OECM as a way to recognize the broad community of players out there that are generally non-traditional in the conservation landscape that are making important contributions. And again, these are recognition of things that already exist on the landscape. They don't require additional tools necessarily, we were able to recognize areas that are achieving biodiversity conservation in working landscapes. We have developed quite extensive standardized criteria and support tools for all of our partners, whether they're subnational governments, Indigenous governments, industry partners, military or other. They're available on our website, and I'd be happy to share them if anyone's interested. The resource requirements for identifying OECMs are typically less significant than for protected areas. Again, at least in the Canadian context, we see this as the recognition of things that already exist rather than a lengthy regulatory process to create something new. I think that's it. Next slide, please. Should you have any questions about the Canadian approach to OECMs or want to obtain any additional information, feel free to contact me at any time. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Olaf. And now we will hear from Mexico. Andrew.
Thank you, Brent. I was telling you when we started this webinar that is, I cannot imagine a better way of starting a day with a good coffee and this conversation with you and other participants here connected to this webinar. My presentation, it has like general 2 parts. One is a reflection and kind of discussion that Mexico is having towards, let's say, a national, well-thought process towards let's say, an OECM identification in the country. And then I'll go very quickly to a very specific case study that we have and want to share with you. Obviously, as a potential OECM, because Mexico hasn't reported any OECMs to the world database. Without any doubt, and under the current scenario and lessons learned from the past strategic plan of the Convention on Biological Diversity, it is of great importance to identify and coordinate national and international efforts to advance in the fulfillment of the commitments before the Convention and other agendas such as climate change, development, among many others. Area-based measures, let's say through protection, restoration, and sustainable use, contribute to the fulfillment of these commitments. Therefore, and in face of this, let's say, great diversity of area-based conservation measures in Mexico, the Foreign Affairs Ministry, together with the Environment Ministry, CONABIO, the National Statistics Office, with experts from WRI Mexico and WF Mexico, carried out a first analysis to identify the area-based conservation measures for the country. The objective of this analysis was to identify the terrestrial, aquatic, coastal, marine measures that contribute to protection, restoration, and sustainable use, and could potentially contribute to the fulfillment of international commitments to be adopted in the new global framework for biodiversity post-2020. No? It is important to mention that this analysis also helps the country clarify and identify area-based conservation measures that contribute directly to protection and other objectives, trying to, let's say, clear the water and have a very concrete idea of what contributes to the 30%, and as Stephen mentioned, what contributes to the 70%, and this is an extraordinary analysis. Through the process, we identified around 50 measures. It also shows that 46.5% of the terrestrial surface and 23.2% of the marine area is covered by specifically 12 different area-based measures in Mexico. Some of them obviously protected areas, but some others that contribute to protection are not recognized officially as a protected area, either federal, state, or municipal, or even voluntary protected areas that we have in Mexico. So there's, let's say, a sort of a package there that could potentially, and I underline this, potentially could be an OECM. Also in this analysis, one of the results, without any doubt very interesting, is that there is no specific measure, area-based conservation measure, which objective is restoration. We have for sustainable use and protection, but not an area based for specifically restoration in the country. And in order to carry out an extensive analysis, in addition to this, and with the leadership and knowledge of CONABIO, the National Commission for Knowledge and Use of Biodiversity here in Mexico, there was also evaluations that were made to identify the benefits in terms of ecological and economic benefits of the measures identified just mentioned. This study, pioneering and unique of its kind, seeks to publicize the areas of opportunity in which work must be done so that from a practical approach, it is defined how to contribute to sustainable development, but specifically what contributes effectively for protection. This exercise represents a first effort in the country, trying to be exhaustive in terms of all the measures relevant for the country, but also as a means to start organizing a comprehensive approach towards the targets that will be defined in the near future. It is also very relevant that community reserves, archaeological sites, among many other measures that exist in the country, were not obviously included in the analysis. So there's no doubt that there must be a second phase to this report to get into finer detail. There is no doubt also in the discussions that we had in Mexico that protected areas are the backbone and main strategy, the main conservation strategy for the country. But there is a clear need to articulate and complement with proper OECMs. Next one, please. One of the examples that I wanted to highlight to all of you is, and again, as a preliminary manner, as a preliminary discussion, is the fishing refugee zones in Mexico. These are one of the most successful tools here in the country, with economic, social, and obviously environmental impacts through the protection of biodiversity, obviously contributes to the agenda for climate change adaptation, among other benefits. It is recognized in the general law on sustainable fisheries and aquaculture here in Mexico, and they are defined officially as delimited areas with the purpose of conserving and contributing naturally to the development of different resources, including obviously fishings, as well to preserve and protect the environment that surrounds them. In Mexico, there are two modalities of fishing refuge zones. One, total fishing refuge zones, another partial. Without any doubt, partial fishing refugee zones are not OECM, but total fishing refugee zones could potentially be an OECM in Mexico. In the total fishing refugee areas, no commercial, didactic, promotion, sports, recreational, or domestic consumption fishing activities could be carried out. And obviously, there's a huge challenge towards the duration of the period of the agreement recognized. Fishing refuges are promoted by local communities and then recognized by the government. They have a clear process to define and decree them. They have the need to formulate a management program. There are obviously some fundings towards them. And currently, they have been identified as a very effective means for biodiversity conservation in some parts of the country. This work has been done by several, obviously, fishing communities in Mexico, together with important NGOs like COBIN, Iparajá, obviously WWF, among other NGOs. The process towards identifying and recognizing potential and OECMs in the country opens a huge opportunity to adjust policy and legislation to fully comply to the global OECM standard. We believe in the country that a due process, a comprehensive process towards this work is the best pathway towards, let's say, a fully and comprehensive 30 by 30. Thank you very much, Brent.
Thank you, Andrew, and also to the rooster for weighing in there. That was bonus. We have a number of questions, and this is really tremendous material. Thank you all. But we have some great questions, so let's jump right to them. The first is posed to Stephen, but on any of these questions, panelists can weigh in as well. I'll just read it here. It's in the Q&A. Do protected area percentage targets, be they 50, 30, 50, 70%, or their effectiveness even matter if protected areas are not in the right place to safeguard ecosystem functioning? You mentioned location, but only in passing, and this is something ignored in much of the rush to make targets, partly because the how is a lot more difficult to communicate than the how much. Stephen.
So thank you, Tunde, for that question. It is spot on. And I did mention that biodiversity is distributed unevenly in the planet, and we know from the literature that we've tended to put protected areas in unproductive areas, in high country, etc., not where they were most important for biodiversity, because they often conflict with people. So OECMs might provide increased tools to do that, but the guidance is abundantly clear on OECMs that they should be in areas that are important for biodiversity. The graph I showed on systematic conservation values is very much in line with those areas that are important for biodiversity. You know, and the examples, I think, have done a really good job of pointing that out. But if we're only going to get 30% in high levels of protection through protected areas and OECMs, it's fundamentally important that they are exactly in the right spots and make a big difference for biodiversity conservation. So I really appreciate you bringing that up and give me the chance to reinforce it.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Looks good. Another question from Nigel Dudley. OECMs are defined by effectiveness. So in theory, are protected areas since the definition changed in 2008. But many protected areas remain ineffective. Has IUCN any policy for how effectiveness will be assured, enforced with OECMs? Will OECMs be delisted from the WD World Database on OECMs if they prove or become ineffective? How would this be managed?
Stephen, do you want to begin that one? Yep.
Well, I can start. It's a fundamental challenge, and it applies to OECMs as well as protected areas. It's up to countries to report, and it's up to countries to supply standards and apply standards according to their national circumstances. There is no police function, there's no audit function in a formal way for the WDPA. UNEP does do a good job working with IUCN to question what countries report, but there is not a police function or a delisting function. The academic world does a good job of looking at effectiveness, and I suspect will continue to. We're wrestling with this question inside the WCPA. I think we're going to have to look at what tools we can bring, both in terms of looking at what countries want to put forward and helping them apply the guidance. And these webinars are one way to do that. Someone else may want to weigh in on this question that the thorny Nigel posed to us all.
Maybe just one addition from the Canadian context, at least when it comes to recognizing OECMs at the outset. Again, we're recognizing things that already exist. So to be able to be recognized in the OECM, there has to be the area has to be effectively managed and have effective means to control the activities that are taking place or could take place in the area. So at least at the outset, they meet the bar. Long term, I think all we could say at this point is it's an active discussion about long-term monitoring for both protected areas and OECMs.
Okay, moving on, and I will point out to everybody, many of our panelists have answered questions through the Q&A function. So if you click on that answered tab, you'll find some other questions and answers, which saves us some time. This next question, because Andrew, you talked about strict fisheries reserves, maybe I'll throw it to you first. In some cases, some fisheries that claim to be sustainably managed are starting to be promoted as OECMs. What do you think about that?
I think that's the perfect example that Stephen highlighted. Within fishing refuge in Mexico, and specifically total fishing refuge, there's no fishing with it. It's a specific zone promoted by local fishermen as a no-take. It's a voluntary scheme recognized by the government, and obviously it has all the process towards a site that could potentially be an OECM. But I want to highlight that at least in Mexico, there's a very comprehensive discussion on what is and what could be an OECM, and what in the other agenda could potentially be a protected area. Even the current administration is decreeing protected areas. So I think it's very important to take the time, recognize what is there, and don't rush things up. In our case, I just want to mention and highlight again the fishing refuge that I mentioned on the example. There's no fishing activities or any other activities within those zones.
Thank you, Andrew, Brent. Yeah, great question. I think it's also important to underscore. You know, we presented on the IUCN specialist groups work because that's who we are, but also the Food and Agriculture Organization is doing and has been doing a lot of good work, particularly around marine capture fisheries. In fact, Tundi, who asked the first question, is a part of that effort as well, and there's also good overlap with our work. Somebody called Men Melian is also both in the specialist group and also supporting FAO with those efforts. And really what it comes down to is really getting into the details of how to measure biodiversity values and the conservation of those values, and what constitutes and meets the criteria set very clearly by the CBD. And so expect a lot of discussion around this, on how you measure it in the first instance, how you monitor it over time, reflecting Nigel's question, whether areas that are shown to not be effective for conservation anymore, be it the fault of the governance authority or not. It's not saying, it's not apportioning blame. It's just saying, if this isn't happening anymore, this needs to be looked at. And I think that, as Stephen said, IUCN doesn't have any policing authority, but this is a major question, and one that will dominate, I think will dominate the next 10 years of work. How do we do this? What's appropriate? And remember that, within the criteria set out for other effective area-based conservation measures, the CBD has essentially set out what it considers to be effective area-based conservation measures, also very clearly. There's equity, delivering long-term conservation of biodiversity, etc. And so, broader questions also, relating to some of the questions that are asked is, what are we going to count Is it everything everywhere that's put through the system, or is it a subset of that that can be shown to be equitable and effective? And so those are some of the broader questions that I think are being further highlighted by the OECM framework. They were there in the PA framework, but I think an even brighter light is being shone on those issues. I hope that contributes to this conversation. No answers, friends, lots more discussion to be had. And as you're hearing, the more diverse the voices and the experiences, the richer the conversation.
Thanks, Harry. The next question from Simon Hoyt, I'm not quite sure who to toss it to, but Kathy, feel free to respond equally as any of the panelists. In countries such as many in Central Africa, where economic exploitation of forest is prioritized over conservation and forest communities' rights, how can OECMs be realized? Tough question.
I don't have any experience in the region, sorry.
Would you like me to lead it?
Please do, Kathy.
So in some parts of the Congo Basin, at least in some countries, where areas are given out as forest concessions, there's even legislation that parts of those should not be logged at all. And again, on a site-by-site basis, it may be useful to look at those areas to see whether they meet the biodiversity criteria of OECMs. Also in those countries, of course, there is some ongoing work to really take a rights-based approach to conservation. So I think that argument about what within production areas qualifies really needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. If most of the area is being logged at an industrial scale, then even if you believe that's sustainable, then perhaps you should be looking at sustainable use targets. If you really believe there are areas that are being set aside for conservation purposes, and they're maintaining important biodiversity values and governance considerations are taken into account as well, I think those areas could be suitable for recommending as OECMs. And actually, that might be a good way to encourage a better recognition of land rights and use rights in some of those areas. And I know quite a lot of work is going to start in the Congo Basin on OECMs. So perhaps we should be looking at OECMs as an opportunity to promote rights-based approaches to conservation there and seeing how we can reconcile both the biodiversity needs and better governance. Thanks.
If I might just weigh in a bit, Brent,
Please.
the whole global biodiversity framework, of which OECMs are embedded, calls for transformative change. We can't continue to do business as usual and recover biodiversity. We can't. So we're going to have to change the way that we think about forests, not only in Africa, but really everywhere. These forests and these other major ecosystem types, we've got to develop a new relationship with them. We've got to think about them different philosophically. They're not just the mines for us to take whatever we can in a maximum way. We have to change our relationship with nature. We're really in deep trouble on this planet. And I hope countries don't see OECMs as an accounting exercise. Oh, what can we put in to get to 30%? That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to bend the curve on biodiversity loss. And this is a golden opportunity to do that. And we've all agreed, we're in the process of agreeing to it internationally.
Great, thank you all. Harry, you've kind of raised your hand to answer this next one. Are there any plans to produce an equivalent of the Protected Areas Management Framework for OECMs to rigorously test effectiveness, expecting to see proposals for a lot of other ineffective conservation measures?
Yeah, Just to say, to underscore what I said before, I sort of wrapped some of my answer to this in what I said before, but this issue is going to be, it is the crux of it, and it's going to be something we're going to all be focusing on. And my sense is that we are going to need further tools to be developed to support local governance authorities, to devolve it to local governance authorities to be monitoring and assessing their areas. And so, existing examples and us pooling resources and the IUCN WCPA acting as a platform for sharing, for thinking, for innovation, that's going to be the way forwards. So that's just my sense. Thanks, Brent.
Great. Tunde comes back. I wasn't suggesting that OECM guidance doesn't help with this. In fact, as you just said, the need to move quickly to protect the right places is a reason to look very carefully at OECMs and catalyze efforts to make as much place-based management contribute to biodiversity outcomes as possible. Thanks again. Any further comment on that? Great. And we have an intervention from Felipe Paredes, who is a member of WCA's steering group.
I think Juliana wanted to come in there, Brent.
Oh, please. Sorry, Juliana, I didn't see. Please, please.
Don't worry. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Brent. No, regarding the question, the comment you just said, I would like to share some of the thoughts we have from the experience in Colombia. Well, I've been following all the questions and things everybody has been sharing on the chat and questions and answers. And we recommend from the experience we had that the guidelines, the IUCN guidelines we already have, it's important that in each country to make like a discussion, review the guidelines and see how we can adapt those guidelines to the country, to the context. Because, for example, in Colombia, and I agree with Stephen, but we also have something else. We also have the recognition of different stakeholders that have been doing conservation or like sustainable management, and that they haven't been recognized yet. So when we do the exercises, when we run the criteria with the areas and with the people, that's what they like mention as something really important. They say we are being recognized. So more like we do want to hold the biodiversity laws, but also in the case of countries like Colombia, we want to recognize those efforts that people have been doing. And something that is really, really key to the OECM that we also have or recommend is, as Harry said, is case by case. Like we do have the criteria, general criteria, but we recommend to do it case by case because every case is different, every area, it has like different governance, people, context. So it's very important to do it case by case. And also I wanted to add something else about the legal recognition. We don't like, I saw many questions about it. We in Colombia, we didn't take that way to do like a legal recognition and to have like a decree or a law, no. Because we do have some laws about those areas. Well, it's a complex topic for Colombia, but in some countries that we have been working on, like Peru and Ecuador, they are going that way. They are trying to review the legislation and trying to adapt it to their own context. So I wanted to share that with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. Very, very interesting. Olaf, you have your hand up. And then
yeah, thank you. Maybe a question for the panel. Just there was a number of questions that came up in the chat about legislation for OECMs, and I think Juliana touched on it briefly as well. And just want to make sure I come back to it because it's an important question and maybe part of it definitional. questions. So again, as I said in my presentation, at least in the Canadian context, and this goes to Stephen's comment about this isn't an accounting exercise. We're trying to protect biodiversity for long-term conservation. But OECM recognition is generally seen as recognizing something that already exists. And with regards to legislation, the idea in Canada, at least, is if a government's intention is to create legislation to protect an area as an OECM, well, that seems to be more of a protected area rather than OECM. So maybe just a definitional challenge there, where again, if you're doing a whole bunch of work to protect the biodiversity of an area, then it's a protected area, not an OECM. Like the example that's come up is you wouldn't create legislation for beef cattle production for the purposes of conserving biodiversity necessarily. Maybe not the best example, but just trying to make sure we're clear about what is a protected area and what is an OECM. And last kind of point mixed in there is, yes, this isn't an accounting exercise, but at least in Canada, again, recognizing OECMs is about recognizing those things that already exist, areas that are achieving the conservation of biodiversity now. And part of the value of recognizing those areas is that we feel that by recognizing them in a certain way, at least in Canada, it does add to their long-term protection. It puts them on the map, literally, draws attention to them, probably draws resources to them as well, which just helps with ensuring that people are looking after them and people are looking at them, assessing their effectiveness, working with the rights holders and the landholders to make sure that they persist long term. So it is a complicated discussion, I think, about we're not accounting our way to the target, but by recognizing these things, we are ensuring that, I think, their long-term persistence. Anyway, but a few random thoughts for the panel and perhaps others to consider.
Thanks, Olaf. Andrew.
Yes, thank you, Brent. Just two quick points, one related to legislation and the other one to this invitation from Kathy in terms of the discussion that was also had in Mexico. Not everything is target 3. And there's a huge opportunity to look to the other 70%, 30%, 50%, or whatever you want of the other targets. And that's a huge opportunity. And we must embrace that opportunity also. We in Mexico believe on the 100% approach, no? And obviously context by context. So I think this is a huge opportunity for countries to promote a thorough analysis of what contributes to that 30% or more, no, case by case, of protection, and what contributes to the other percentage, and that to other targets. And that's a huge opportunity. We should all embrace that opportunity in a responsible way. In the other element of legislation, and that's also been a discussion, at least here in Mexico, is that and the need to recognize the concept of OECMs in our legislation or policy. But the fundamental question behind and that we've had is, if nobody is responsible for recognizing and reporting OECM, then what happens? No, it's important also to, at least in the country levels, identify clearly who is responsible and accountable in the future for those potential OECMs. And that, I think that's the challenge within procedures. So that's one of the discussions. It's not necessarily to incorporate elements of the guidelines within our legislation, but who is responsible to take this forward, to report to official databases, among other questions. It's more process.
Thanks, Andrew. And Kathy, I think quite appropriately give you the final word as we come up to the line here.
Well, thanks. And thanks very much. It's been a good discussion. I just wanted to come in on the legislation side. Often it takes a very long time to declare a protected area. Sometimes, you know, you've got an area that's already effective. You want to recognize it. You can even do it under existing legislation, not necessarily protected area legislation, but say a Fisheries Act. There's also an interesting example from Indonesia where former logging concessions are designated as production forest. The government didn't want to make them protected areas, as they would then have to commit resources to protect them. In effect, they've turned into private protected areas with a conservation objective. But the exciting thing is that the NGO consortium running those areas has worked with the government to get new legislation to recognize what are called ecosystem restoration concessions. So there'll be different opportunities in different countries. The really key thing, I think there's two key messages out of this. One, there's a whole continuum from conservation through sustainable use to general mainstreaming, like you may do in your garden by planting a butterfly bush. They're all good for biodiversity, but you wouldn't map all of them against Target 3. And the second key message is, if we've got these areas that are delivering effective conservation, then we really need to understand why and how can we help to ensure that they do persist long term. So if that's down to the governance and management, what kinds of support do those who are in charge of those areas need? It may be simple recognition, it may be endorsement of their land use rights, or it may be payments for ecosystem services. But I think that's a key part of moving this forward. I just want to thank everybody for all the questions, because it's helpful to us as we're going to prepare some frequently asked questions material. But thanks very much on my part.
Stephen, did you still want to make a second final word? Kind of a word of length?
Only to say I thought that the examples from Colombia, Mexico, and Canada were really well considered, really well thought out, made really strong efforts to apply all the criteria around OECMs and are going to be great as we go forward for really strong examples for how to do this right. So I'm really encouraged by those on the ground processes. Congratulations to you all.
Great. Well, there's more to say, and we could go on all day, but I want to respect your time and close out pretty close to the time. Thanks to everyone on the panel, to Ruchir Sharma at IUCN's Global Protected and Conserved Areas Program, managing the technology for us, and all of you for tuning in, as Kathy said, for your good questions. Please note that we plan to follow up with regional webinars on this topic to get closer to the ground, and see the chat for an opt-in form for information on future events, just to make sure you get them.
With that, I will close this session, and Kathy has something to say. Over to you, Kathy.
Thank you. I just want to thank everybody for participating and for the very good questions. These are helpful to us as we go forward. If you're very interested in this topic and you're already a member of WCPA, please think about joining the OECM specialist group. I just want to remind everybody, this is a conservation category. And what we're really interested in is the quality, not quantity. So we're offering guidance, but we are certainly not in a position to police what governments put forward to the databases. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and have a lovely day, everyone. With this, we close the session. Thank you very much.